From the Brooklyn Nets team in recent memory to a Chicago Bulls side featuring Michael Jordan, here are some of the worst teams ever to make the NBA playoffs. Kicking things off, let me reintroduce the Brooklyn Nets of 2020. On paper, this was a pretty decent team, but given the injuries, the COVID-19 pandemic, and some failed chemistry, this Nets side was horrible on the court. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving were already missing, but somehow the Nets fell into the playoffs with a 35-37 record. Most of their squad opted not to return for the season due to the pandemic, and that meant a lot of replacement players were brought in and immediately put under pressure. Almost half of their squad was made of players signed as replacements. It was a sorry sight to see them come up against the Milwaukee Bucks, a team truly enjoying a sensational season and one that would go on to absolutely destroy the Nets in the first round. Something that didn't come as a surprise to anyone involved. But how about a franchise that knows how to go all the way? That's right, even the Boston Celtics have had their time in the trenches with this roster back in 2004. Remember, they'd go on to win the NBA in 4 years' time in 2008. But in 2004, the Celtics had an extremely average roster. They only had Paul Pierce from their future Big Three that would win the title in 2008. And he couldn't change the fact that the Celtics had an extremely mediocre roster. Somehow, they made it to the playoffs, finishing 8th in the division with a 36-46 record. And it was an achievement for sure given the number of injuries they'd suffered that season. Their luck didn't change in the playoffs, and with some key players missing, the Celtics took on the Pacers in the opening round. Of course, for Boston, it would be the closing round as they were swept with disdain to end their season abruptly. But the Pacers would experience their worst only a few years later. Their 2010-2011 roster remains one of the worst to make the postseason. The East had just gotten considerably stronger thanks to the Big Three in Miami, but the Pacers actually fancied their chances after a poor run of form during the 2000s. They finally broke the curse and progressed through to the playoffs with a 37-45 record, which was good enough to keep them in the 8th spot in the East.
And when he looked at it, he let it go.
How far was that?
He was about 5 steps behind the three-point line.
Paul George.
However, they would face the MVP winner Derrick Rose's Chicago Bulls team, which more than just took care of Danny Granger, Paul George, and Roy Hibbert over 5 games. But for the next one, we're switching conferences and moving to the West. The San Antonio Spurs of 1988. When you look back at the NBA records, you see that David Robinson, a future NBA champion, was technically on the Spurs books for this season. However, he didn't actually play a single game because of his service in the Navy. So in his absence, the Spurs were led by Alvin Robertson instead, and had no other prominent star in their lineup. Robertson would become an all-star that season and took the team to the playoffs, but holding a 31-51 record, it came as absolutely no surprise to anyone when the Lakers made a mockery of them in the first round. It was almost unfair for the Spurs to face the Lakers, who were at their dominant best during the 80s, something that the Boston Celtics of 1995 also experienced, when they were completely dismantled by the Orlando Magic in the opening round. Led by the aging Dominique Wilkins, the Celtics weren't exactly expected to do much. But when you've got a superstar like Wilkins, you fancy your chances no matter what. At least he led them to the playoffs, right? But it was ugly, as the Celtics moved into the postseason with a horrendous record, only to face the extremely dominant Orlando Magic side, which made quick work of the Celtics, knocking them out with relative ease. But you know what they say about eras, right? They come to an end. The Magic enjoyed a bit of success in the 21st century, but they hit a fresh new low back in 2020. In fact, 2020 was particularly a weak year for the East, and one of the reasons was this horrible Magic team, led by Nikola Vucevic and Evan Fournier. The team lacked any kind of identity. A young team, yes, but they just didn't have anything else going for them.
Nice job. Look at it. Keeps the hands up in the passing lane, gets a piece. And pretty good job handling the basketball. Good awareness. finding Aaron Gordon on that baseline.
Somehow, though, they slid into the playoffs with something that you could only explain as a brilliant stroke of luck, because with a 33-40 record, they weren't expected to do that. However, due to the COVID restrictions and lesser games played, they snuck in and booked a postseason date with the table-topping Bucks, and they would even go on to get a win over the Giannis-led Milwaukee side, but that was that. The Magic were eliminated in 5, but they're far from the worst teams to make the playoffs, as I won't forget the Chicago Bulls team that made the playoffs back in the 1968 season. I mean, I don't remember them because I watched them, I just know I read about them. Now, most Bulls fans in particular would remember Carlos Boozer leading the Bulls in the early 2010s, but go back a few decades into the late 60s, they were led by another Boozer, namely Bob. Now, the Bob Boozer-led Bulls squad was pretty mediocre. The 60s were more or less a time to forget for the Bulls, but they would actually make the playoffs in 1968. But if you dig a little deep and take a look at their regular season record, you'd know that it was a blessing in disguise that they had been missing the playoffs before that regularly. Yet, with an absolutely horrific 29-53 record, the Bulls moved into the postseason and expectedly got rinsed by the Lakers in the opening round. They showed the Bulls absolutely no mercy. Unfortunately, though, the next entry is another one from the Eastern Conference. This time, it's a team that you folks definitely remember. I'm talking about the one and only the Milwaukee Bucks of 2013, one of the biggest memes from NBA history. The Bucks were just bad. They did have some decent older players like Brandon Jennings and Monta Ellis, but they lacked any proper playmakers. Despite their limitations, the Bucks made the playoffs. Unfortunately for Jennings, though, he would make a prediction that the world still hasn't forgotten, because it was a horrible prediction, to say the least. So don't think anyone's ever forgetting it. He predicted that the Bucks will go through their first-round matchup in 6 games, which was actually against the defending champions, Miami Heat. Bold prediction, huh? Well, it got memorable because LeBron and company destroyed the Magic in 4. Had enough of the Eastern Conference slander? Or do you folks have a place for one last team? I'm sure you do, because this one actually features his airness, Michael Jordan. Got your attention, didn't I? Yep, I'm talking about the Chicago Bulls of 1986. Some people tend to forget, but just drafting Michael Jordan wasn't going to make the Bulls a great team. They struggled in the late 80s, and despite some memorable moments from MJ, the Bulls weren't exactly a great team. Far from it, actually. But they went into the 86 season with a lot of hopes, having acquired the likes of John Paxson, George Gervin, and Charles Oakley. Unfortunately, an injury to Michael Jordan would completely blow their hopes of a possible championship run, handing them a reality check in the process. But they still snuck into the playoffs with an abysmal 30-52 record, and the Celtics would wipe the floor with them to knock them out. That's all I had on the worst teams to ever make the NBA playoffs.